The Arizona Territory in the summer of 1884 stretched endlessly under a sun that showed no mercy to man or beast. Red Rock Canyon carved its way through the landscape like a wound that refused to heal, its walls rising 200 feet on either side of a narrow floor littered with the bones of animals foolish enough to wander in without water. The air shimmered with heat waves that made distant objects dance like mirages, and the silence was the kind that filled his ears with oppressive weight until he began to question his own sanity. Samuel Harrison rode his bay mare through this furnace with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned that rushing toward anything in this country usually led to an early grave. At 29, his face already carried the deep lines of a man who had seen too much and slept too little. The Colt, 45 on his right hip, sat heavy with the weight of necessity rather than swagger, and the Winchester in his saddle scabbard bore the scratches and dents that spoke of hard use in harder places. 3 years had passed since Samuel hung up his cavalry uniform, but the habits of a soldier never truly left a man's bones. His gray eyes still swept the horizon with the methodical precision of someone trained to spot trouble before trouble spotted him. His shoulders carried the rigid posture that came from years of standing at attention, even though the blue wool and brass buttons were long gone. What hadn't faded was the weight he carried in his chest, a burden that grew heavier with each passing day rather than lighter. The canyon walls rose around him like broken cathedral arches, their red sandstone surfaces carved smooth by countless seasons of flash floods and desert winds. Shadows offered brief sanctuary from the heat, but they also provided perfect cover for anyone with hostile intentions and a good rifle. Samuel's mare picked her way carefully along the rocky trail, her hooves finding purchase on stone, worn smooth by the passage of countless travelers who had learned to respect this unforgiving land. Samuel's saddlebags carried more than the usual supplies of jerky, hardtack, and ammunition. Wrapped carefully in oiled leather and tucked deep where curious eyes couldn't find it, lay a document that represented more money than most men saw in a lifetime. The mineral rights agreement for the Silver Crown mine bore official territorial seals and legal language that boiled down to one simple fact. Whoever controlled these papers controlled access to $50,000 worth of silver ore buried in the mountains northeast of Tucson. The irony wasn't lost on Samuel. 3 years ago, he had worn the blue uniform that drove the Apache people from these very lands, following orders that seemed clear and righteous at the time. Now he carried papers that might give those same people a chance to reclaim something precious, something that had been stolen from them in the name of progress and manifest destiny. His mind drifted, as it often did in the quiet moments, back to that bitter winter morning in 1881 when everything had changed. The memory came in fragments, sharp and painful as broken glass. Snow had covered the ground at Willow Creek, turning the Apache winter camp into a picture that might have graced a Christmas card if not for what was about to happen. Samuel had been a second lieutenant then, young and eager to prove himself worthy of the bars on his collar. Colonel Morrison had briefed the attack with the clinical precision of a man describing a training exercise rather than an assault on families sleeping peacefully in their lodges. Hostile camp, Morrison had said, his finger tracing positions on a hand-drawn map. Intelligence reports weapons stockpiling and plans for spring raids on settlements. We hit them hard and fast before they can scatter. Samuel had raised his hand with the hesitation of a junior officer questioning a superior. Sir, are we certain about the intelligence? The scouts reported seeing mostly women and children. Morrison's pale eyes had fixed on Samuel with the kind of stare that could freeze water in July. Son, are you questioning the validity of information gathered by professional scouts and confirmed by territorial authorities? No, sir, Samuel had replied, because that was what second lieutenants said when colonels asked such questions. Just want to make sure we're prepared for all contingencies. The only contingency you need to prepare for is following orders, Morrison had said with finality. Dismissed. And the attack had come at dawn, when the cooking fires were just beginning to send thin spirals of smoke into the clear mountain air. Samuel's company had approached from the east, moving through the pine trees with the silence that came from weeks of practice and the motivation that came from believing they were doing righteous work. The first shots had shattered the morning quiet like stones thrown through glass. Samuel had expected return fire, organized resistance, the kind of military engagement he'd been trained for at West Point. Instead, he'd found himself charging into a camp of families whose only crime had been trying to survive another winter in the mountains their ancestors had called home for generations. Chief Running Bear had been the last to fall. Samuel found him standing beside the central fire, an elderly man with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held no fear, only a sadness that seemed to encompass the entire sweep of human folly. The chief held no weapon, made no aggressive move, simply stood with the dignity of a man who understood that death was coming and intended to meet it on his own terms. "You are very young for such terrible work," the chief had said, in English, better than Samuel had expected from a man living in the wilderness. Samuel's rifle had wavered in his hands. Around them, the shooting was dying down as Morrison's men finished their work with the systematic efficiency of soldiers following orders. The smell of gunpowder mixed with wood smoke and something else, something that would haunt Samuel's dreams for years to come. "I'm sorry," Samuel had whispered, though he wasn't sure if the chief could hear him over the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Chief Running Bear had nodded slightly, as if Samuel's apology was both unnecessary and insufficient. "My daughters," he had said, "take care they escape. Promise me." Samuel had seen the three young women at the edge of the camp, running toward the tree line with the desperate speed of deer fleeing a forest fire. His training told him to raise the alarm, to direct pursuit, to ensure no hostiles escaped to carry word to other camps. Instead, he had found himself nodding to the old chief, making a promise he hadn't understood the weight of at the time. The shot that killed Chief Running Bear came from Samuel's rifle, fired on Colonel Morrison's direct order when the young lieutenant hesitated too long. The bullet took the old man in the chest, and he fell forward into the central fire, his gray hair catching flame for just a moment before the coals scattered and died. 43 Apache had died at Willow Creek that morning. The official report listed them as hostile combatants eliminated in a preemptive strike against planned aggression. Samuel knew better. He had seen the faces of children, the terror in women's eyes, the complete absence of weapons beyond a few hunting rifles and skinning knives. It had been a massacre, pure and simple, and he had been part of it. The memory faded as a sound reached Samuel's ears that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the desert. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving with a kind of coordinated precision that spoke of men with military training and hostile intentions. Samuel's hand dropped automatically to his rifle, muscle memory taking over as his mind cataloged possibilities and escape routes. That's when the first bullet smashed into the canyon wall inches from his head. The crack of the rifle echoed off the stone walls like thunder, and Samuel's mare reared in terror, nearly throwing him from the saddle. Training kicked in faster than conscious thought. Samuel rolled from his horse's back, yanking the Winchester from its scabbard as he dove for cover behind a pile of boulders that had fallen from the canyon rim sometime in the distant past. His ribs protested the impact with sun-heated stone, but pain was a luxury he couldn't afford to acknowledge. "Samuel Harrison!" The voice boomed down from the canyon rim with the casual menace of a man who held all the advantages and knew it. "Got something that belongs to us." Samuel recognized the voice even though 3 years and 1,000 miles separated them from their last meeting. Jake Calloway. Back at Fort Apache, Calloway had worn sergeant's stripes and taken orders with the grudging respect of a career soldier who understood the chain of command. Apparently those days were over. "Don't recall owing you anything, Jake," Samuel called back, working the lever of his Winchester and scanning the canyon rim for movement. The rifle held 15 rounds, plus the 6 in his Colt. "Against how many?" "Last time we talked, you were heading to a court-martial for selling army supplies to traitors." A harsh laugh bounced off the canyon walls. "Turns out the army doesn't pay close attention to paperwork when a man knows how to disappear proper. Unlike some folks who just change their address and think that makes them invisible." 2 more rifles opened up from different positions along the rim, their muzzle flashes bright against the shadowed rock. Samuel counted muzzle flashes and estimated angles, falling back on artillery training from his West Point days. At least 4 shooters, maybe 5, spread out across 150 yards of high ground. They had him pinned down with no escape route except straight up the canyon walls, which might as well have been straight up to the moon for all the good it would do him. The smart play would be to surrender, hand over the mineral rights papers, and hope they let him ride away with his life. But Samuel had learned that hope was a poor substitute for action, and he suspected that Jake Calloway wasn't the type to leave witnesses behind to complicate his business arrangements. A flash of movement caught Samuel's eye on the eastern rim. Brown hat against red stone, there for just an instant before ducking back behind cover. Samuel took careful aim and squeezed the trigger, feeling the Winchester buck against his shoulder. A cry of pain echoed down into the canyon, followed by a string of curses creative enough to make a mule skinner blush. "That was unneighborly, Harrison." Calloway's voice carried a note of genuine anger now. "Boys, seems our friend needs some convincing." The gunfire intensified until the canyon sounded like the inside of a thunderstorm. Bullets sparked off granite and whined overhead, sending chips of stone flying like angry hornets. Samuel pressed himself flat against his boulder, feeling the heat of ricochets pass close enough to singe his hair. His horse had bolted at the first shot, taking his water and most of his spare ammunition with her. The rounds in his rifle and the bullets in his Colt would have to last until this ended, one way or another. The sun climbed higher, turning the canyon into a furnace that made the air shimmer like water. Samuel's shirt was already soaked with sweat, and his mouth felt like he'd been chewing cotton. The shooting had stopped for the moment, but he could feel them up there, waiting with the patience of men who understood that time and the desert heat were on their side. A few more hours and thirst would do most of their work for them. Samuel tried to calculate his options and didn't like any of them. The papers in his saddlebag weren't just about money. They represented something larger, something that might begin to balance scales that had been tipped wrong for too long. But good intentions wouldn't stop bullets, and noble purposes didn't make a man bulletproof. That's when he heard the voices. They came from the direction of the canyon mouth, soft words in a language he recognized but didn't understand. Apache, Samuel felt his chest tighten, was something that might have been fear, or might have been something else entirely. If Calloway's men saw Apache in this canyon, there would be killing for no better reason than the color of their skin and the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Three figures moved along the canyon floor with the kind of silence that only came from generations of learning how to survive in harsh country where mistakes meant death. Samuel could see them clearly from his position behind the boulders. Two women and what appeared to be a young girl, traveling on foot with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever they could carry in woven baskets slung across their shoulders. The eldest looked to be perhaps 25 years old, moving with the confident grace of someone who belonged to this land in a way that settlers never would. Her hair was black as a moonless night, braided with small beads that caught the light when she turned her head. Even from a distance, Samuel could see the intelligence in her dark eyes as she scanned the canyon walls for danger with the methodical precision of a trained scout. Behind her came another woman, younger, but carrying herself with the quiet authority that marked her as someone with specialized knowledge. She bore a collection of small leather pouches and bundles of dried plants, the tools of someone who understood the secrets that nature kept hidden in root and leaf. Her movements were gentle but purposeful, like water finding its natural course around obstacles. The third was barely more than a girl, 19 at most, but her eyes held the kind of wariness that came from seeing too much too young. She carried a small bow with arrows fletched in the traditional way, and the manner in which she held it suggested she knew how to use it. There was something in her posture that reminded Samuel of a young deer, alert and ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. They were walking directly into the line of fire. Samuel made his choice without thinking about consequences or personal safety. He raised himself above his cover and whistled, the same two-note signal he'd used to call his horse back at the ranch. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, and all three Apache women froze instantly, their heads turning toward the source of the sound. "Get down," Samuel shouted, his voice hoarse from thirst and heat. "Shooters on the rim! Take cover!" For a moment that stretched like eternity, the eldest woman's eyes found his across 30 yards of broken ground. Samuel saw her take in his position, his Winchester, the blood on his shirt from where flying rock chips had cut him. She saw a white man with a military bearing and weapons, someone who should have represented everything dangerous about the world beyond Apache territory, but she also saw the genuine fear in his eyes. Fear not for himself, but for their safety. The rifles opened up again from the canyon rim. "3 more targets, boys." Calloway's voice carried a note of satisfaction that made Samuel's blood run cold. Looks like it's turning into a regular turkey shoot. The Apache women moved like shadows made flesh, finding cover behind rocks and scrub brush with the fluid efficiency of people who had been dodging bullets longer than it should have been necessary. But they were trapped now, caught in the same deadly crossfire that had Samuel pinned down, with nowhere to run and limited options for survival. A chill ran through Samuel's veins. Not terror, but sudden understanding that came when a man finally understood what he was fighting for. The papers in his saddlebag weren't just legal documents or potential wealth. They were about the right of these people to exist in the land that had always been theirs, before surveyors' chains and government proclamations had carved it up like a side of beef. He checked the chambers of his Colt, counting 5 rounds remaining. The Winchester held 8 more, 13 shots between him and whatever came next. It would have to be enough. The eldest Apache woman was perhaps 20 feet away now, crouched behind a fallen boulder with her companions. Samuel could see her studying the canyon walls with the same methodical patience he'd been taught at West Point, marking the positions of their attackers and calculating angles of fire. She was a warrior, he realized, trained in the old ways, but adapting to new realities with the flexibility that had kept her people alive for centuries. Their eyes met again, and this time she nodded slightly. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. 2 fighters recognizing each other across the divide of history and blood, understanding that survival trumped old grievances when death was the only alternative. Samuel rose from cover and fired at a muzzle flash on the eastern rim. The Winchester cracked like a whip, and he heard a curse echo down from above, followed by the sound of someone scrambling for better cover. When he ducked back down, he found that the Apache woman had moved closer, close enough to speak without shouting over the echoes. "Why do you help us?" she asked in English that was accented but clear, each word carefully chosen and precisely delivered. Samuel met her gaze without flinching. "Because it's the right thing to do." She studied his face for a long moment, reading something there that seemed to satisfy her. Then she turned to her companions and spoke quickly in Apache, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions under pressure. The younger woman began preparing something from her collection of herbs and powders, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a trained healer. The girl strung her bow with smooth, economical motions that spoke of countless hours of practice. "How many shooters?" the eldest woman asked, turning back to Samuel. "4, maybe 5. Their leader is Jake Calloway, former Army sergeant. They want papers I'm carrying." Samuel paused, studying her face. "You know this man?" Her expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over the desert. "We know him. He has taken our people before, sold them to ranchers who need workers and don't ask questions about wages." The weight of that simple statement hit Samuel like a physical blow. These weren't random travelers caught in someone else's fight. They were refugees, survivors of raids and forced relocations, still running from men who saw them as obstacles to be removed or commodities to be exploited. "The papers I'm carrying," Samuel said, reaching carefully for his saddlebag, "they're mineral rights to land that used to belong to your people. Could be worth something if they fell into the right hands." The woman's dark eyes sharpened with interest, but before she could respond, Calloway's voice boomed down from the rim again. "Time's up, Harrison. Send down those papers or we start with the squaws." Samuel felt the old rage building in his chest, the same anger that had driven him to volunteer for the cavalry in the first place. But this time it was clean, focused on something that actually mattered instead of abstract concepts like duty and manifest destiny. "Jake," he called back, his voice carrying across the canyon like a challenge. "You want the papers? Come down here and take them." The answer came in the form of concentrated rifle fire that turned their section of the canyon into a gallery chute. Bullets spanged off rocks and whined overhead like angry wasps, forcing all 4 of them to press themselves flat against whatever cover they could find. Samuel counted muzzle flashes and tried to calculate how much ammunition Calloway's men were burning through. Sooner or later, they'd have to reload, and that might provide an opportunity. That's when Samuel felt the sharp, burning pain in his left side. He looked down to see blood seeping through his shirt, spreading in a dark stain that told him more than he wanted to know about his immediate future. The bullet had come in low, angled down from the rim, and from the way his breathing felt shallow and labored, it had probably cracked at least one rib and might have done worse damage to whatever lay beneath. The Apache woman saw the blood and moved without hesitation, crawling across open ground between their positions with complete disregard for the bullets still flying overhead. Her hands were gentle but sure as she pressed against the wound, and Samuel could see her evaluating the damage with the clinical precision of someone who had treated battlefield injuries before. "How bad?" Samuel asked, though he could already tell from the way his strength was flowing out with his blood. "Bad enough," she replied honestly, "but not finished yet." The younger woman had reached them now, carrying her collection of healing supplies like a field surgeon's kit. She worked with quick, efficient movements, pressing a mixture of crushed plants against the wound and binding it with strips torn from her own clothing. The pain was immediate and intense, like someone had pressed a red-hot iron against his ribs, but Samuel could feel the bleeding beginning to slow. "Thank you," he managed between gritted teeth. "Do not thank us yet," the eldest woman replied. "First we must live through this day." The shooting from above had slackened as Calloway's men repositioned themselves for a final assault, but Samuel could hear movement along the rim. They weren't the type to wait forever, especially with the sun beginning its long descent toward the western horizon. Soon they'd come down into the canyon to finish this face-to-face, and Samuel wasn't sure he had the strength left to reload his rifle, much less use it effectively. "I can't move," he admitted, hating the weakness in his voice. "If they come down here, I'm finished." The three Apache women exchanged looks that seemed to communicate volumes without a single word being spoken. Something passed between them, some understanding that went deeper than language or conscious thought. Then the eldest turned back to Samuel with an expression that was both resolved and resigned. "Among our people," she said carefully, choosing each word with the precision of someone explaining a sacred concept to an outsider, "there is an old law. When someone saves a life, they become responsible for that life until it can stand alone again." Samuel blinked, trying to focus through the growing haze in his mind. The herbs the healer had used were powerful, deadening the pain, but also making his thoughts feel distant and disconnected. "I don't understand. You warned us of danger when you could have stayed hidden. You shared your fight with us when you could have tried to bargain for your own life. You helped us live when it would have been easier to let us die." She paused, glancing up at the canyon rim where their enemies waited like vultures. "By our law, your life is now bound to ours." The implications of what she was saying slowly penetrated the fog in Samuel's mind. "You're saying you can't leave me here." "We cannot, and you cannot travel in your condition." She looked at her companions again, and he saw them nod with the gravity of people accepting a sacred obligation. "We will carry you." "That's impossible," Samuel protested weakly. "I'm too heavy, and they'll track us down within hours. You'll all end up dead because of me." The woman smiled then, the first expression of genuine warmth he'd seen from her. It transformed her entire face, revealing a beauty that was both fierce and gentle. "You do not know Apache women very well, do you?" Before Samuel could respond, she was giving orders in rapid Apache, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The healer began repacking her supplies with practiced efficiency, while the youngest scouted the best route out of the canyon. They moved with the kind of coordination that spoke of long practice, people who had learned to work together under the worst possible circumstances. "What are your names?" Samuel asked, feeling the need to know something personal about the women who were risking their lives for his. The eldest hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether to trust him with something precious. "I am Ayana," she said finally. "It means eternal blossom." "Kiona," said the healer, indicating herself. "Forever flowing water." "Nayeli," added the youngest, her voice carrying a hint of defiance. "I love you." "Samuel Harrison," he replied, "and I'm more grateful than I can say." Ayana's expression grew serious again as she studied his face. "Do not be grateful yet. First, you must understand what this means. Among our people, when we save someone, they become part of our family until they can stand alone. It is not a small thing." Samuel tried to process what she was telling him through the growing weakness in his body and the strange effects of whatever herbs Kiona had used to treat his wound. "Are you saying I'd be bound to your people?" Like a prisoner? Not a prisoner, Ayana corrected, but not free to simply walk away either. The bond is sacred. It cannot be broken by choice, only by death or by fulfilling the obligation completely. The sound of boots on stone echoed down from above, punctuated by Calloway's voice giving orders to his men. They were coming down into the canyon, probably tired of waiting for the heat and time to do their work for them in. Samuel estimated maybe 10 minutes before they reached the canyon floor, maybe less if they rappelled down the steeper sections. Doesn't matter, Samuel said, trying to focus on what was important rather than the philosophical implications of Apache law. If we stay here, we're all dead. If you're willing to help me, I'm willing to accept whatever that means. Ayana studied his face one more time, looking for something she seemed to find. Then she nodded to her companions, and they moved into action with the fluid efficiency of a well-trained military unit. Kiona produced a travois from her pack, an ingenious contraption made from carved poles and leather strips that could be assembled in minutes. It was obviously something they'd used before, probably for carrying elderly or injured members of their group during the long, forced marches that had driven them from their ancestral lands. Nayeli had already identified the best escape route, a narrow crack in the western wall that would lead them out of the canyon before Calloway's men could reach the bottom. They lifted Samuel as gently as possible, but even their care couldn't prevent waves of pain from washing over him as they secured him to the travois. His vision grayed around the edges, and for a moment he thought he might pass out entirely, which would have been a mercy given the agony in his side. "Stay awake," Ayana commanded, her voice cutting through the fog in his mind like a blade through silk. "Sleep now, and you may not wake up." Samuel fought to focus on her face, using it as an anchor to consciousness. There was strength there and determination, but also something else that he couldn't quite identify. A sadness that went bone deep, the kind that came from losing too much over too many years. "The papers," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "In my saddlebag. If something happens to me, make sure your people get them." Ayana had already retrieved the leather portfolio from where it had fallen when his horse bolted. She examined it briefly before tucking it inside her own belongings with the care of someone who understood its potential value. "Nothing will happen to you," she said, with the kind of certainty that brooked no argument. "We do not let people die after we have claimed responsibility for them." The first shouts from the canyon floor told them that Calloway's men had reached the bottom and found the blood. They had perhaps 5 minutes before the pursuit began in earnest, maybe less if the former sergeant was as good a tracker as Samuel remembered. Nayeli led them through the crack in the canyon wall, a passage so narrow they had to turn the travois sideways to get it through. Samuel bit back groans as the motion jarred his wounded side, but he understood the necessity. This wasn't the time for complaints about comfort or considerations of personal dignity. On the other side of the passage, they found themselves in a smaller canyon that opened onto the vast expanse of the Sonoran Desert. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Samuel uncomfortably of blood and fire. In a few hours, darkness would provide cover, but it would also bring cold and the additional challenge of navigating rough terrain by starlight. Kiona checked his bandages and gave him water from her small supply, just enough to wet his lips without waste. The movement of the travois over rough ground was making him nauseous, but he forced himself to stay conscious and alert. These women were risking their lives for him based on laws and traditions he didn't fully understand. The least he could do was try to help them succeed. Where are we going?" he asked Ayana as she adjusted the travois straps. "There is a place," she said without elaborating further. "Hidden water, defensible position. We can reach it before full darkness if we move quickly." Samuel tried to calculate distances and travel times, but his thinking felt sluggish and unreliable. The herbs Kiona had used were powerful, deadening the pain, but also clouding his mind in ways that made complex reasoning difficult. He had to trust that these women knew what they were doing, that their knowledge of this harsh country was greater than his own. As they began their journey across the open desert, Samuel found himself studying the 3 Apache women who had saved his life. They moved with an economy of effort that spoke of hard experience, each step calculated to conserve energy while covering ground as efficiently as possible. This wasn't their first time running from armed pursuers, and their survival skills had been honed by necessity rather than choice. The weight of what had happened began to settle on him as they traveled. These women hadn't just happened to be passing through Red Rock Canyon at the right moment. They'd been traveling with a purpose, going somewhere specific, and now they'd taken on the additional burden of keeping him alive. The sacred law Ayanna had mentioned might compel them to help him, but the cost would be measured in increased danger for all of them. Behind them, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, growing steadily closer. Calloway had found their trail and was coming after them with the determination of a man who had too much to lose to give up easily. The mineral rights papers weren't just valuable in themselves. They were the key to something larger. Something that went beyond simple greed into the realm of systematic exploitation and government-sanctioned theft. Samuel closed his eyes and tried to find strength for whatever came next. For 3 years, he'd been trying to forget what had happened at Willow Creek, trying to convince himself that following orders absolved him of personal responsibility for the consequences. But lying on this travois, being carried to safety by Apache women who should have every reason to hate him, he was beginning to understand that some debts could only be paid forward. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky when they finally reached their destination. Hidden among a grove of ancient cottonwood trees, a small spring bubbled up from deep underground, creating a tiny oasis that seemed almost miraculous after the harsh emptiness of the desert. In the gathering darkness, it looked like sanctuary, but Samuel knew that sanctuary was a temporary thing, especially when Jake Calloway was on your trail with blood in his eyes and profit on his mind. The real test of this unlikely alliance was just beginning, and the bonds being forged between them would either save them all or get them killed. As Ayanna helped him from the travois and Kiona prepared to examine his wound more thoroughly, Samuel realized that his life had taken a turn he could never have anticipated. 3 years ago, he had been part of the machine that destroyed these people's world. Now his survival depended entirely on their mercy and their adherence to laws older than any government or territory. The irony was bitter as desert water, but it was also something else. It was justice of a kind that couldn't be written into legal codes or enforced by military tribunals. It was the justice of consequences finally catching up, of debts long overdue being called in by the universe itself. And for the first time since Willow Creek, Samuel Harrison began to believe that redemption might actually be possible, even for someone who had strayed as far from grace as he had. The night settled around them like a blanket, bringing both concealment and new dangers. But for now, they were alive. They were together, and they were bound by something stronger than circumstance or convenience. They were bound by honor, Apache style, and that was proving to be stronger than bullets or badges or any law, written by men in distant capitals who had never walked a mile in desert boots. The hidden spring among the cottonwoods provided more than water. It offered the first sense of safety any of them had felt in days. The trees formed a natural windbreak against the desert's nighttime chill, and their roots had created a small depression that concealed the light of a carefully banked fire. Kiona worked by the flickering flames, cleaning Samuel's wound with water heated in a small clay pot she carried among her healing supplies. Samuel gritted his teeth as she peeled away the makeshift bandage, the dried herbs and blood coming free in strips that told their own story of pain and survival. The bullet had carved a furrow along his ribs without penetrating his chest cavity, but infection was already setting in around the edges of the wound. Without proper treatment, he would be dead within days. "This will hurt," Kiona warned, preparing a fresh mixture of crushed plants and heated water. "But the pain means healing." Samuel nodded, bracing himself against the base of a cottonwood tree. As the healer began her work, he found his attention drawn to Ayanna, who sat across the fire cleaning her weapons with the methodical precision of a professional soldier. Her movements were economical and practiced, and he recognized the ritual from his own military experience. The careful inspection of each component, the test of action and trigger, the final reassembly that left everything ready for immediate use. "You've done this before," Samuel observed, his voice tight with pain as Kiona's treatment took effect. Ayanna looked up from her rifle, a weapon Samuel now recognized as a modified Spencer repeater, probably taken from a cavalry patrol during one of the numerous skirmishes that had marked the Apache Wars. "Many times," she said simply, "my father taught me that a warrior's weapons are sacred. They must be cared for like children." respected like elders. The mention of her father sent a chill through Samuel that had nothing to do with the desert night. Something in her tone, a particular reverence mixed with grief, triggered a memory he had been trying to suppress for 3 years. Chief Running Bear had carried himself with the same quiet dignity, the same careful attention to detail that Samuel now saw reflected in his daughter. Your father, Samuel said carefully, testing the dangerous waters of the past. Was he a war chief? Ayana's hands stilled on her rifle. Across the fire, Nayeli stopped sharpening her arrows, and Kiona paused in her healing work. The silence that fell over their small camp was heavy with unspoken history. He was many things, Ayana said finally. Chief, war leader, keeper of our people's stories. But mostly he was my father. She resumed cleaning her rifle, but Samuel could see the tension in her shoulders. He died 3 winters ago, killed by soldiers who came to our winter camp while we slept. Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. The careful neutrality in Ayana's voice couldn't disguise the pain underneath, and he realized with growing horror that he was looking at one of the 3 figures he had seen fleeing into the forest that terrible morning at Willow Creek. Chief Running Bear's daughters. The women he had promised a dying man he would protect. Willow Creek, he whispered, the words falling from his lips like stones into still water. Ayana's head snapped up, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him feel exposed and vulnerable. You know that name? It wasn't a question. Samuel could see in her expression that she was beginning to piece together fragments of memory, connecting the white soldier who had hesitated at a crucial moment with the wounded cowboy they had saved from Calloway's guns. The recognition was dawning on both sides, and Samuel knew there was no point in denying what they both understood. I was there, Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. 2nd Lieutenant, Company C, 4th Cavalry. I was the one who... I killed your father. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Nayeli's hand dropped to her knife handle, and even Kiona stopped her healing work to stare at Samuel with something that might have been shock or might have been long-suppressed rage. But it was Ayana's reaction that mattered most, and her response surprised him. She didn't reach for her weapon. She didn't curse him or demand explanations or give in to the kind of primal fury that would have been entirely justified. Instead, she simply nodded, as if confirming something she had already suspected. I thought I recognized something about you, she said quietly. The way you held your rifle, the way you moved even when wounded. You were the young soldier who hesitated. Samuel swallowed hard, tasting ashes and regret. Your father asked me to make sure you escaped. It was the last thing he said. And yet you shot him anyway. My colonel gave a direct order. In the Army, hesitation in combat is considered cowardice. I was young, scared, trying to prove I belonged. Samuel knew how inadequate the explanation sounded, how pathetic his justifications must seem to a woman who had lost everything because of his weakness. It doesn't excuse what I did. Nothing can excuse that. Ayana set down her rifle and leaned forward, studying his face in the firelight. Do you remember what he said to you just before? Samuel closed his eyes, the memory as clear and painful as if it had happened yesterday. He said I was very young for such terrible work. And what did you say to him? I said I was sorry. Samuel opened his eyes to find Ayana still watching him with that unsettling intensity. He told me to take care that you escaped. I said I would, but then He couldn't finish the sentence. But then you killed him because a white colonel ordered you to. Ayana's voice was steady, but Samuel could hear the current of old pain running underneath. And here we are 3 years later, with me bound by sacred law to keep you alive. The irony of the situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. Samuel, the man who had destroyed their family, was now under their protection according to laws older than the United States itself. The cosmic justice of it was almost overwhelming in its complexity. I understand if you want to break the bond, Samuel said finally. Leave me here to face whatever comes. After what I did, I have no right to your protection. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with the kind of concentrated attention that suggested she was wrestling with profound questions. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of careful consideration. Among our people, she said slowly, there is a belief that everything happens in circles. What goes around must come around. You helped destroy our world, and now you are completely dependent on our mercy to survive." She paused, glancing at her sisters, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Perhaps this is how the circle closes. Kiona resumed her work on Samuel's wound, but her touch was gentler now, as if understanding the full context had somehow changed her approach to healing him. "The law that binds us to you," she said softly, "it is not just about preserving life. It is about giving people the chance to become better than they were." Niley, who had been silent throughout the revelation, finally spoke up. "You could have let us die in that canyon. You could have used our presence as a distraction to escape. Instead, you chose to warn us, to share your fight with us." She paused, considering her words. "Maybe you are not the same man who killed our father." Samuel felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 3 years. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something equally precious: the possibility of redemption. These women were offering him a chance to become worthy of the mercy they were showing him, and he understood that such chances came rarely in a man's life. "What do I have to do?" he asked. "First," Ayanna said practically, "you have to heal. Then we will see what kind of man you choose to be." The sound of distant hoofbeats broke the spell of their conversation, reminding them all that philosophical discussions were a luxury they couldn't afford while Calloway's men were still hunting them. Nayeli moved to the edge of their small sanctuary, peering through the cottonwood branches toward the desert beyond. "4 riders," she reported quietly, "maybe 500 yards out, moving toward the old trading post." Samuel tried to sit up straighter, his military training asserting itself despite his weakened condition. "How many men does Calloway have with him?" "We counted 6 guns in the canyon," Ayanna replied. "You wounded one, so 5 left active." "They'll make camp at the trading post," Samuel said, thinking through the tactical situation. "Water there, defensible position, good sight lines. In the morning, they'll start tracking us properly." Kiona finished binding his wound with fresh strips of cloth and sat back on her heels. "You cannot travel far in your condition. We need time for the healing to take hold." "Time is what we don't have," Nayeli pointed out, returning from her scouting position. "Those men will not give up easily. Whatever those papers are worth, it's enough to keep them hunting until they find us." Samuel reached carefully into his shirt and withdrew the leather portfolio, handling it like the dangerous object it had become. "Mineral rights to the Silver Crown mine. $50,000 worth of silver ore, maybe more." He paused, studying their faces. "But it's more than just money. This land is sacred to your people, isn't it?" Ayanna's expression sharpened with interest in something that might have been hope. "That is Apache burial ground. Our ancestors sleep in those mountains." "Your father knew about the silver deposits," Samuel continued, pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place. "That's why he was camping so close to what would become the mining claims. He was trying to protect the graves." "How do you know this?" Kiona asked. Samuel's laugh was bitter and self-recriminating. "Because Morrison, my commanding colonel, briefed us on the mineral surveys before we attacked your camp. The official story was that you were planning raids on settlements, but the real reason was to clear the area for mining operations." The 3 women exchanged looks that spoke volumes about their understanding of government duplicity and military collaboration with business interests. They had lived through the systematic theft of their homeland, had watched legal documents and surveyors' chains divide up country that had belonged to their people for centuries. "So these papers," Ayanna said slowly, "they could give us legal claim to land that was stolen from us in the first place. If they ended up in the right hands, yes, but Calloway isn't working alone. There are powerful men in Tucson and Washington who want those claims buried along with anyone who might contest them." A new sound reached them through the night air, the distinctive howl of a coyote, but with a rhythm and pattern that Samuel recognized as artificial. Apache signal calls, used to coordinate movement across long distances without alerting enemies to their presence. Nayeli responded with a series of soft whistles, and within minutes a young Apache brave melted out of the darkness like a shadow gaining substance. He was perhaps 16 years old, with the lean build and alert eyes of someone who had learned to survive in hostile country through speed and intelligence rather than strength. "Dakota," Ayanna breathed, relief evident in her voice. "We thought you were dead." The young man dropped to one knee beside their fire, his breathing labored from hard travel. "Almost was," he said in English, heavily accented, but understandable. "White men came to the Hidden Valley 3 days ago. They took 12 of our people, mostly women and children. The rest scattered into the deep desert." Samuel felt his stomach drop. Slave raiders. Calloway's been selling Apache prisoners to ranchers who need workers and don't ask questions about wages or working conditions. "Where did they take them?" Kiona asked, her healer's instincts already anticipating the need for rescue and treatment. "Fort Defiance," Dakota replied. "The old army post, abandoned but still defensible. They are holding our people there while they arrange sales to ranchers in California." Ayana's face hardened with the kind of cold determination that Samuel recognized from his military experience. It was the expression of someone calculating the odds and preparing for war, regardless of the personal cost. "How many guards?" she asked. 8, maybe 10. They have good weapons, plenty of ammunition, but they do not expect trouble from a broken band of refugees. Samuel forced himself to think tactically despite the pain medication and exhaustion. "Fort Defiance is 2 days' hard ride from here. If we move fast, we might reach it before they transfer the prisoners." "We?" Ayana turned to look at him with raised eyebrows. "You can barely sit up without assistance." "I can ride if you help me into the saddle, and I know military tactics, fortress defenses, how soldiers think." Samuel met her gaze steadily. "You saved my life according to your law. Maybe this is how I start earning that gift." The debate that followed was conducted mostly in rapid Apache, with occasional translations for Samuel's benefit. He could follow enough of the conversation to understand that they were weighing the sacred obligation to protect him against the practical necessity of rescuing their captured family members. The decision, the decision, when it finally came, was delivered by Ayana with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "We will try to rescue our people," she said, "but you will not fight. You will stay with the horses and provide guidance only. If you die because we pushed you too hard, we will have violated our responsibility to you." Samuel wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he could contribute more than tactical advice, but he understood the wisdom of her position. In his current condition, he would be more liability than asset in any direct confrontation. "There's something else," he said, remembering details from his briefings about the mining operation. "Fort Defiance sits on high ground overlooking the approaches to Silver Crown Mine. Whoever controls that fort controls access to the mineral deposits." Ayana's eyes narrowed with understanding. "So rescuing our people and securing your mineral rights are the same objective." It would seem that way. Dakota had been listening to their conversation with the intense concentration of someone learning new information that might prove vital to survival. "There is more," he said quietly. "The white men spoke of a colonel coming from Fort Apache, someone important who wants to see the Apache problem solved permanently." Samuel felt ice form in his veins. "Morrison, Colonel James Morrison, 4th Cavalry. You know him? He was my commanding officer at Willow Creek. If he's involved in this, it's not just about money or mining rights. It's about finishing what we started 3 years ago." Samuel looked around the circle of faces illuminated by firelight. He wants to eliminate the last free Apache in the territory, and he's using Calloway's greed to do it. The weight of this revelation settled over them like a funeral shroud. They weren't just dealing with a gang of opportunistic raiders. They were facing a systematic campaign designed to remove the last obstacles to complete territorial control over Apache lands. "How long do we have?" Ayana asked. "Morrison moves fast when he has a clear objective. If Dakota saw them 3 days ago, the colonel will be at Fort Defiance within the week." Ayana stood and began gathering their supplies with the efficient motions of someone preparing for war. "Then we move now. Kiona, prepare travel medicine for all of us. Nayeli, scout the best route toward the fort. Dakota, you'll guide us to where our people are hidden." "What about Calloway?" Samuel asked. Ayana's smile was sharp as a knife edge. "Let him follow. When we reach Fort Defiance, we'll be ready for him." As they broke camp and prepared for the next stage of their journey, Samuel found himself marveling at the strange turns his life had taken. 3 years ago, he had been a soldier following orders to destroy these people. Now he was preparing to risk his life to help them reclaim what had been stolen. The irony was profound, but it was also something else. It was justice of a kind that couldn't be written into legal codes or military regulations. It was the justice of consequences and second chances, of debts paid and circles closing. As Kiona helped him onto the horse Dakota had brought from the hidden valley, Samuel realized that he was no longer running from his past. He was riding toward it, armed with knowledge and determination and the support of people who had every reason to hate him, but had chosen mercy instead. The night was cold and the journey ahead was dangerous. But for the first time since Willow Creek, Samuel Harrison felt like he might actually deserve to survive what was coming. Behind them, the small spring continued to bubble up from deep underground, feeding the cottonwood trees that had provided sanctuary to travelers for generations. Ahead lay Fort Defiance and whatever reckoning awaited them there. But between past and future, in the present moment of horses and starlight and shared purpose, Samuel found something he had thought lost forever. The possibility of redemption through action rather than words, through sacrifice rather than self-pity. The desert stretched endlessly around them, harsh and unforgiving, but also possessed of its own stark beauty. Like the justice they were riding toward, it was neither kind nor cruel, simply honest in its demands. And honesty, Samuel was learning, was the foundation upon which all real healing was built. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Sonoran Desert, painting the landscape in shades of gold and rose that made the harsh country appear almost welcoming. Samuel had managed to stay conscious through most of the night's travel, though the constant motion of his horse had reopened part of his wound. Kiona rode beside him, monitoring his condition with the professional attention of a field surgeon, occasionally calling for stops to adjust his bandages or provide water mixed with pain-dulling herbs. They had covered perhaps 20 miles since leaving the Cottonwood Grove, following game trails and ancient Apache paths that avoided the main routes where Calloway's men might expect to find them. Dakota led them with the confidence of someone who had learned every rock and ravine in this country, reading signs invisible to less experienced eyes. "How much farther to where your people are hiding?" Ayana asked during one of their brief rest stops. Dakota pointed towards a line of red mesas rising from the desert floor like broken teeth. Hidden canyon beyond those rocks. Water there, good defensive positions, but dangerous to approach in daylight with so many horses. Samuel studied the terrain through eyes trained in military reconnaissance. The mesas would provide excellent cover for an ambush, but they would also conceal the movement of anyone trying to approach their destination. If Calloway had somehow gotten ahead of them, those rocks would be the perfect place to wait. "We need to assume we're being followed," Samuel said, his voice rough with fatigue and pain. "Calloway knows this country almost as well as you do, and he has the advantage of not caring about wounded prisoners slowing him down." "Then we split up," Ayana decided. "Dakota and Nayeli will go ahead to warn our people and prepare them for travel. Kiona and I will bring Samuel by a different route, moving more slowly but staying off the obvious paths." It was a sound tactical decision, but Samuel could see the reluctance in the sisters' faces at the prospect of separating. They had survived the last 3 years by staying together, supporting each other through hardships that would have broken most people. Dividing their small group felt like inviting disaster. "There's another option," Samuel offered. "Leave me here with enough water for a day or two. Come back for me after you've gathered your people and planned your assault on Fort Defiance." Ayana's response was immediate and uncompromising. "No, we do not abandon people under our protection. Even when keeping them slows you down and endangers others? Especially then." Her dark eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been determination. "That is what separates us from our enemies. We do not sacrifice the weak for the convenience of the strong." The rebuke stung because Samuel recognized the truth in it. How many times during his military service had he seen commanders make calculations that placed expediency above human life? How many times had he himself followed orders that treated people as expendable resources rather than individuals deserving of protection? They proceeded according to Ayana's plan, with Dakota and Nayeli disappearing into the maze of canyons and arroyos that led toward the hidden Apache encampment. Samuel found himself alone with the 2 older sisters for the first time since their strange alliance had formed, And the intimacy of their situation brought with it a new awareness of the bonds developing between them. Kiona rode close enough to monitor his condition, her attention focused on medical concerns rather than conversation. But Ayana seemed to use the relative privacy as an opportunity to probe deeper into questions that had been troubling her since his identity was revealed. "Tell me about the morning at Willow Creek." At Willow Creek, she said as they navigated a narrow canyon that would conceal them from distant observers. Not the official version, but what you actually saw and felt. Samuel had spent 3 years trying not to think about those details, but now he found that the memories came clearly, as if proximity to Chief Running Bear's daughters had unlocked doors in his mind that had been sealed shut by guilt and shame. "It was the coldest morning I'd ever experienced," he began, his voice taking on the distant quality that came with painful recollection. "The kind of cold that makes your breath visible and turns rifle barrels so cold they can freeze to bare skin. Colonel Morrison had us up before dawn, checking weapons and equipment, making sure everyone understood their assigned positions." "Did you know it was a peaceful camp?" Kiona asked quietly. "The intelligence reports said otherwise. We were told your people were stockpiling weapons for spring raids, that children and women were being used as shields for warriors preparing for war." Samuel paused, remembering his younger self's willingness to believe what authority figures told him. "But when we got close enough to see the camp clearly, it was obvious the reports were wrong." "How obvious?" "No sentries posted, no defensive positions prepared, cooking fires burning openly instead of being concealed. Your people were living like families, not warriors preparing for battle." Samuel's voice grew heavy with self-recrimination. "I tried to raise concerns with Morrison, but junior officers don't question colonels, especially not in front of the men." Ayana guided her horse around a pile of fallen boulders, her movements automatic while her attention remained focused on Samuel's account. "What was my father doing when you reached him?" "Standing by the central fire, completely calm. No weapon, no attempt to flee or fight. He was waiting for death with the kind of dignity that made me feel small and cowardly." Samuel closed his eyes, seeing again the old chief's weathered face and knowing eyes. "He spoke to me in English, said I was very young for such terrible work." "That sounds like him," Kiona murmured. "He always tried to find ways to teach, even when teaching might be the last thing he ever did. He asked me to promise that his daughters would escape safely. I gave him my word, but then Morrison ordered me to shoot, and I—" Samuel's voice trailed off. "And you followed orders like a good soldier," Ayana finished for him. "But you also made sure we had time to reach the forest before anyone pursued us." Samuel looked at her in surprise. "You remember that?" "I remember a young soldier who could have directed pursuit immediately, but chose instead to check on the man he had shot. Those extra minutes of delay saved our lives." And the revelation that his moment of hesitation had actually accomplished something positive was almost overwhelming. For 3 years, Samuel had tortured himself with the belief that his weakness had been purely selfish, a failure of courage that served no one. To learn that it had actually helped the chief's daughters escape added layers of complexity to his guilt that he wasn't sure how to process. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because healing requires understanding what actually happened, not what we wish had happened or what we fear and might have happened." Kiona's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years treating wounds, both physical and spiritual. "You cannot cure an infection without cleaning out all the damaged tissue first." They rode in contemplative silence for the next hour, each lost in their own thoughts about the strange paths that had brought them together. Samuel found himself studying the landscape with new eyes, trying to see it as the Apache did, as homeland rather than wilderness, as sacred space rather than empty territory waiting to be claimed and exploited. The sun was approaching its zenith when they finally reached the hidden canyon where the remnants of Ayana's people had taken refuge. Samuel's first impression was of careful concealment and desperate improvisation. The entrance was narrow enough that a single defender could hold off a much larger force, but the space inside was cramped and offered little room for the dozen Apache who had survived the raid on their previous camp. Most were women and children, with a few elderly men whose age had saved them from being taken as valuable slave labor. They regarded Samuel with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity, clearly recognizing him as a white man but uncertain about his role in their current circumstances. Dakota met them at the canyon entrance with news that was both encouraging and troubling. Our people are ready to travel, but scouts report soldiers moving toward Fort Defiance from the east. Many soldiers, with wagons and supplies for a long campaign. Morrison, Samuel said with certainty. He's not just coming to oversee the prisoner exchange. He's planning something bigger. Ayanna dismounted and helped Samuel down from his horse. Her touch gentle but efficient as she checked to make sure the ride hadn't done serious damage to his healing wound. How much bigger? Samuel tried to think tactically despite the fog of pain and exhaustion that clouded his thoughts. Morrison doesn't do anything small. If he's bringing wagons and supplies, he's planning to establish a permanent presence in this area, probably using Fort Defiance as a base for systematic sweeps designed to capture or kill every Apache left in the territory. An elderly Apache man approached their group, moving with the careful dignity of someone whose authority came from wisdom rather than strength. His hair was white as fresh snow, and his deeply lined face spoke of 8 decades spent learning the harsh lessons that survival in this country demanded. "I am Naalnish," he said in English, carefully pronounced, but clearly understandable. "These people are my responsibility while the war chief is captured." Samuel recognized the formal challenge in the old man's words. He was being asked to explain his presence and justify his claim to protection from people who had little enough to spare for their own. "Honored elder," Samuel replied, using the respectful form of address he had learned during his military service. "I am Samuel Harrison, formerly of the cavalry, now bound to your people by sacred law. I carry papers that may help restore your lands, and I offer whatever knowledge I have to help rescue the captured." Naalnish studied him with eyes that seemed to look directly through to his soul. "You are the soldier from Willow Creek," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "I am. And yet Ayanna and her sisters claim protection over you. This seems unusual." "The law is clear," Ayanna interjected, her voice carrying the authority of someone who would not be questioned on matters of tribal custom. "We found him dying. We saved his life. He becomes our responsibility until he can stand alone. And when he stands alone?" Samuel met the old man's gaze directly. "When I stand alone, honored elder, I hope to have earned the right to stand beside you." Naalnish considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We will see what manner of man you choose to become." He turned to address the group as a whole. "Prepare for travel. We move toward Fort Defiance at sunset." The next few hours were spent in careful preparation for what everyone understood would be the most dangerous undertaking any of them had attempted since escaping the original attack on their tribal lands. Samuel, despite his weakened condition, found himself consulted on tactical questions and military procedures, his knowledge of Army protocols proving valuable as they planned their approach to the fortified position where their people were being held. The fort was designed to withstand siege by traditional Apache forces, Samuel explained, using a stick to draw diagrams in the sand. High walls, good sight lines, defensible gates, but it was also designed by people who thought like soldiers, not like Apache warriors. "Meaning?" Dakota asked. "Meaning they planned for direct assaults and formal siege tactics. They didn't plan for people who could move like shadows and think like the land itself." Samuel pointed to his crude diagram. "The water supply comes from a spring inside the walls, but the overflow creates a small stream that runs under the eastern wall. In high water, that passage might be large enough for a person to crawl through." Ayanna studied the diagram with the focused attention of a general planning a campaign. "How many guards would they post for a dozen prisoners?" "Normally, 4 men on the walls, 2 in the compound, 1 at the gate, but if they're expecting reinforcements, they might double that." Samuel paused, remembering details from his service years. The weak point isn't the fortifications. It's the fact that they don't expect serious resistance from what they see as a broken band of refugees. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the small group of Apache survivors prepared for what might be their final journey together. Samuel found himself mounted on a steady pony, his wound rebandaged, and his strength supplemented by herbal preparations that Kiona assured him would keep him functional for the next 12 hours. "After that," she warned him privately, "your body will demand rest whether you want to give it or not. The medicines I am using push the spirit beyond what the flesh can naturally sustain." Samuel nodded his understanding. Whatever happened at Fort Defiance would need to be resolved quickly, or he would become more liability than asset to the people depending on his knowledge and experience. As they rode out of the hidden canyon, Samuel found himself wondering what Chief Running Bear would think of this unlikely alliance between his daughters and the soldier who had killed him. The old chief had been a man of profound wisdom and spiritual depth, someone who understood that the universe operated on principles larger than individual revenge or personal justice. Perhaps he would have seen the cosmic appropriateness of his killer becoming the instrument of his people's salvation. Perhaps he would have understood that redemption often came through the very relationships that seemed most impossible to forge. The desert night settled around them like a familiar blanket, bringing with it the cold clarity that came with understanding that everything they had worked toward would be decided in the next few hours. Behind them lay the safety of the hidden canyon and the option of continued flight. Ahead lay Fort Defiance and whatever reckoning awaited them there. Samuel had entered this strange partnership as a wounded man seeking survival. Now he found himself riding toward danger as a willing participant in something larger than personal salvation. The transformation had been so gradual that he hadn't noticed it happening. But now it was complete and irreversible. He was no longer just Samuel Harrison, former cavalry officer trying to escape the consequences of his past actions. He was part of an Apache war party, bound by sacred law and personal choice to people who had taught him that honor was measured not by following orders, but by choosing to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow reassuring in their constancy. Whatever happened at Fort Defiance, it would happen under the same sky that had witnessed countless generations of conflict and reconciliation, loss and recovery, justice delayed, but not denied. And for the first time since Willow Creek, Samuel Harrison rode toward battle without fear because he finally understood what he was fighting for. Fort Defiance squatted on the desert plateau like a wound that refused to heal, its adobe walls and wooden watchtowers silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Built during the height of the Apache Wars to project American military power into the heart of traditional tribal lands, it had been abandoned when the government declared the region pacified. Now it served a darker purpose, its defensible walls sheltering men who traded in human misery. Samuel studied the fortress through a spyglass borrowed from Dakota's meager equipment, his military training automatically cataloging defensive positions and potential weaknesses. The fort was smaller than he remembered from his service days, perhaps 200 feet square, with walls 8 feet high topped by wooden palisades. 2 watchtowers commanded overlapping fields of fire, and the single gate was reinforced with iron bands that would resist anything short of artillery. "How many guards can you see?" Ayanna whispered, crouching beside him on the rocky outcrop that provided their observation post. "4 on the walls, moving in regular patterns. Probably 2 more inside, plus whoever's guarding the prisoners directly." Samuel lowered the spyglass and turned to face the small group of Apache warriors who represented the last free members of their band. "They're following military procedures, which means they're taking this seriously." Nyalnish, the elderly leader who had assumed command in the absence of their captured war chief, studied the fort with the patient attention of someone who had learned that hasty decisions led to dead warriors. "The water passage you mentioned?" Samuel pointed toward the eastern wall, where a thin stream of water emerged from beneath the foundation stones. "There, but I can't tell from this distance whether it's large enough for a person to crawl through. We'd need to get much closer to be certain." "I'll scout it," Nayeli volunteered, already checking her weapons and preparing for the dangerous reconnaissance mission. "Too risky in daylight," Ayanna said. "We wait for full darkness, then move in coordinated groups. Nayeli and Dakota scout the water passage. Kiona and I approach from the south where the walls are lowest. Samuel stays here with Nyalnish and provides overwatch." Samuel wanted to argue, wanted to insist that his knowledge of military tactics made him too valuable to leave behind. But he could feel the weakness spreading through his body as Kiona's medicines wore off, and he understood that in his current condition, he would be more liability than asset in close combat. "What about weapons?" he asked instead. Dakota displayed their meager arsenal with the pride of someone who had learned to make every bullet count. 3 rifles of various makes and conditions, 2 old army pistols, a handful of knives, and perhaps 30 rounds of ammunition total. Against professional gunmen in a fortified position, it seemed pathetically inadequate. "We have other weapons," Nalnish said quietly. "Patience, knowledge of this land, nostalgia, the righteousness of our cause. Sometimes these matter more than bullets." As the sun disappeared behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, the small war party prepared for their assault on Fort Defiance. Samuel found himself checking and rechecking his weapons with the nervous energy of a man who understood that the next few hours would determine whether his attempt at redemption ended in success or tragedy. Kiona approached him as the others made final preparations. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by horses and left for dead," Samuel admitted, "which is probably accurate." The healer smiled grimly. "The medicines I gave you will sustain you for perhaps 2 more hours. After that, your body will shut down whether you will it or not." She handed him a small leather pouch. "If you start to lose consciousness, chew these leaves. They will give you enough energy for one final effort, but they will also likely kill you if your heart is weak." Samuel tucked the pouch inside his shirt, hoping he wouldn't need to find out whether his heart was strong enough to handle Apache stimulants. "Kiona, if this goes badly..." "It will not go badly," she interrupted. "We are fighting for our families. That makes us stronger than men fighting for money." As full darkness settled over the desert, Ayana gave the signal to begin their assault. Samuel watched through the spyglass as shadowy figures moved across the open ground toward the fortress, barely visible even to someone who knew where to look. Apache warriors moved like ghosts, using every fold in the terrain and every patch of shadow to conceal their approach. The plan was simple in concept but complex in execution. Nayeli and Dakota would attempt to infiltrate through the water passage and locate the prisoners, determining how many guards they would need to overcome and the best route for evacuation. Meanwhile, Ayana and Kiona would create a diversion at the main gate, drawing attention away from the real assault. Samuel's role was to provide covering fire from the overlook if things went wrong, and to coordinate the withdrawal once the prisoners were freed. It wasn't the kind of active participation he would have preferred, but it was honest work that played to his strengths while acknowledging his limitations. The first hour passed in tense silence. Samuel divided his attention between watching the fortress through the spyglass and monitoring the surrounding desert for signs of approaching reinforcements. Calloway's men were still out there somewhere, and Colonel Morrison's column was reportedly no more than a day's march away. Timing would be crucial if they hoped to rescue their people and escape before overwhelming force arrived. Movement near the eastern wall caught Samuel's attention. 2 figures emerged from the stream like spirits materializing from water itself. Nayeli and Dakota had successfully infiltrated the fortress, which meant the most dangerous part of their mission was about to begin. "How many prisoners?" Nalnish asked him quietly. Samuel adjusted the spyglass, trying to penetrate the shadows within the fort's walls. "I can see figures moving near what looks like a storage building. Maybe 8 or 10 people, hard to tell for certain." "And guards?" "Still following their patrol patterns. If our people inside can stay quiet, they might reach the prisoners without raising an alarm." The old Apache leader nodded, his weathered face grim with the knowledge that success or failure might come down to luck as much as skill. "And if they cannot stay quiet?" Samuel checked his rifle one more time, making sure it was loaded and ready. "Then we find out how well these old walls stand up to determined Apache warriors." A sudden commotion near the fort's main gate answered that question sooner than anyone had hoped. Shouts erupted from the watchtowers, followed by the distinctive crack of rifle fire. Orange muzzle flashes lit up the night like deadly fireflies, and Samuel could hear Calloway's voice bellowing orders from somewhere inside the walls. "They've been discovered," Nalnish observed with the calm of someone who had lived through many battles. Samuel trained the spyglass on the source of the disturbance and felt his heart sink. A group of mounted men was approaching the fort from the north, their horses moving at a gallop that spoke of urgent business. Even in the darkness, he could see the glint of military insignia and the precise formations that mark professional cavalry. "Morrison," he breathed, "he's arrived early." The tactical situation had just become infinitely more complex. Instead of facing a handful of guards in an isolated fort, they were now dealing with what appeared to be a full cavalry patrol reinforcing an already defensible position. The odds had shifted from difficult to nearly impossible. "We need to call off the attack," Samuel said urgently. "Get our people out of there before—" His words were cut off by a series of explosions from within the fort. Not gunpowder, Samuel realized, but something else. Apache fire starters, designed to create maximum confusion and panic in minimum time. Smoke began pouring from several buildings within the walls, and the disciplined patrol patterns of the guards dissolved into chaos as men ran toward the flames. "Ayana," Nyalnish said with something that might have been pride. She always was better at improvisation than planning. Through the spyglass, Samuel could see figures moving rapidly across the fort's compound. Apache prisoners being led toward the eastern wall where the water passage offered their only hope of escape. But Morrison's cavalry was already at the gates, and there wasn't enough time for everyone to escape through such a narrow route. "I have to get down there," Samuel said, already moving toward his horse despite the protest from his wounded body. "You can barely stand," Nyalnish pointed out reasonably, "which makes me perfect for what I have in mind." Samuel hauled himself into the saddle through sheer determination and the last reserves of Kiona's medicines. "Morrison knows me. If I surrender myself and the mineral rights papers, it might buy our people time to escape." The old Apache leader studied him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. "You would sacrifice yourself for people you barely know?" "I'd sacrifice myself for people who taught me what honor actually means." Samuel gathered his reins, trying to ignore the way the world seemed to tilt and spin around him. "Tell Ayana that the debt is paid. All of it." Before Nyalnish could object, Samuel spurred his horse down the rocky slope toward Fort Defiance, and whatever reckoning awaited him there. Behind him, the old man's voice carried across the desert night like a benediction. "Ride with honor, soldier. Your ancestors would be proud." The descent toward the fort was a nightmare of loose rock and darkness, made worse by Samuel's deteriorating condition and the urgency of his mission. By the time he reached level ground, his vision was blurring around the edges and his grip on the reins was becoming increasingly uncertain. But he could see the chaos within the fort's walls, could hear the sounds of combat and confusion that meant his friends were still fighting for their lives. The main gate stood open, with cavalry horses milling about in the confusion as Morrison's men tried to establish order in the smoke-filled compound. Samuel rode straight toward them, his hands raised to show he carried no immediate threat, his voice raised in the kind of command tone that years of military service had burned into his vocal cords. "Colonel Morrison, Samuel Harrison, former second lieutenant, requesting parley." The response was immediate and violent. Rifle barrels swung toward him from multiple directions, and Samuel found himself surrounded by hard-faced cavalrymen who looked like they would be perfectly happy to shoot first and identify bodies later. But Morrison's voice cut through the potential violence like a blade through silk. "Hold your fire. I want to talk to this man." Colonel James Morrison emerged from the smoke and firelight like something from Samuel's worst nightmares. Older now, with gray streaking his brown hair and new lines around his pale eyes, but still carrying himself with the rigid authority that had made him such an effective officer and such a dangerous enemy. He studied Samuel with the kind of clinical attention usually reserved for insects under magnifying glasses. "Samuel Harrison," Morrison said slowly, tasting the name like wine of uncertain vintage. "I wondered when you'd surface again. Thought you might have had the good sense to stay disappeared." "Surprised to see me, Colonel?" "Surprised to see you alive, certainly. Calloway's been hunting you for the better part of a week." Morrison stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "I assume you have something I want, or you wouldn't be here making dramatic gestures." Samuel reached slowly into his shirt and withdrew the leather portfolio containing the mineral rights documents. $50,000 in silver mining claims, plus information about Apache movements in this sector. Morrison's eyes sharpened with interest, but Samuel could see the calculation behind them. The colonel was weighing the value of the papers against the pleasure of killing the man who had always represented everything he despised about junior officers with consciences. And in exchange for these valuable items, safe passage for the Apache prisoners, all of them with enough water and supplies to reach the territorial border. Morrison's laugh was like broken glass scraping against stone. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate, Lieutenant. Sergeant Calloway has already paid me handsomely for the privilege of killing you personally." Then Calloway's going to be disappointed. Samuel's voice carried a strength he didn't feel, drawing on reserves he wasn't sure existed. Because I'm not the same man who left your command 3 years ago. No, you're the man who's been consorting with hostiles and interfering with legitimate business operations, which makes you a traitor as well as a deserter. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the eastern wall, where Apache prisoners were attempting to escape through the water passage while their rescuers provided covering fire. Samuel could see Ayanna among the defenders, her rifle speaking with the kind of precision that came from a lifetime of making every shot count. Your friends are about to die, Morrison observed conversationally. Brave effort, but doomed from the start. I have 30 men to their handful, better weapons, superior position. Maybe, Samuel agreed, but I have something better than superior firepower. Which is? Samuel smiled, feeling the cold clarity that came with understanding exactly what he was going to do. I have the knowledge of where you keep your ammunition. The explosion that rocked the fort's western wall was everything Samuel had hoped for and more. The ammunition bunker, located exactly where military regulations required it to be placed, went up like the 4th of July and Christmas combined. The blast shattered windows, toppled the watchtower, and sent Colonel Morrison's carefully ordered assault into complete chaos. In the confusion that followed, Samuel saw Apache figures moving like shadows toward the breach in the wall, carrying their rescued family members toward freedom in the desert beyond. Ayanna paused at the gap in the shattered adobe, looking back toward where Samuel sat on his horse in the midst of Morrison's scattered troops. As chaos erupted around them, Ayanna's eyes found Samuel's across the smoke-filled compound. In that moment, everything else faded. The gunfire, the shouting, the smell of burning adobe. She saw not the soldier who had killed her father, but the man who had chosen honor over survival. Ayanna, he called out, his voice cutting through the din. She paused at the breach in the wall, her people streaming past her toward freedom. Samuel, he started, then stopped. What words could bridge the chasm between them? What promise could he make from a saddle he might never leave alive? She understood. The circle is complete, she called back. You are free, Samuel Harrison, free to choose who you become. And if I choose to find you again? Her smile was fierce and beautiful. Then you had better learn to track like an Apache. Their eyes met across the flame-lit compound, and Samuel saw understanding pass between them. The debt was paid, the circle closed, the promise made to a dying chief finally fulfilled. Ayanna raised her rifle in a brief salute, then disappeared into the night with her people. You magnificent bastard, Morrison breathed, his voice carrying a mixture of rage and grudging admiration. You just cost me a fortune in government contracts. Samuel swayed in his saddle, feeling Kiona's medicines finally failing and his body beginning the process of shutting down. Good, he managed to say. Maybe next time you'll think twice before selling people like livestock. Morrison's hand moved toward his pistol, but the motion was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Calloway and his surviving men. The former sergeant's face was blackened with smoke and twisted with fury, and the rifle in his hands was pointed directly at Samuel's chest. Nobody moves, Calloway snarled. Harrison's mine. Been hunting this son of a bitch for a week, and I ain't letting him die easy. Sergeant, Morrison said carefully, perhaps we should discuss. Ain't no discussion, Colonel. You got your money, I get my revenge. Calloway's finger tightened on the trigger. Any last words, Lieutenant? Samuel looked around the ruined fort, at the scattered soldiers and the smoke rising from burning buildings. In the distance, he could see figures moving through the desert, Apache families reunited and heading toward freedom in the deep wilderness where cavalry columns couldn't follow. Yeah, Samuel said quietly, I kept my promise. The shot that rang out across the desert night didn't come from Calloway's rifle. It came from the darkness beyond the shattered wall, where Nayeli crouched with a captured cavalry carbine and the kind of marksmanship that came from a lifetime of hunting in harsh country. Calloway pitched forward into the dust, his weapon unfired, his hunt finally ended. Apache! Someone shouted, and the compound erupted in gunfire as Morrison's men tried to locate targets that weren't there. But the rescue was complete, the prisoners freed, and the desert had swallowed Samuel's unlikely allies like water absorbing rain. Morrison stood over Calloway's body, his face grim with the knowledge that his carefully planned operation had collapsed into expensive failure. 30 men, he muttered, 30 trained cavalry against a handful of refugees, and they made us look like fools. Samuel slumped forward in his saddle, no longer able to maintain the strength necessary to sit upright. His wound had reopened during the excitement, and he could feel his life flowing out with his blood onto the desert sand. But he had done what he came to do. The promise was kept, the debt paid, the circle closed. "What do we do with him?" one of the soldiers asked, gesturing toward Samuel. Morrison studied his former subordinate with the expression of a man trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. "We take him back to Fort Apache for court-martial. Treason, desertion, consorting with hostiles, destruction of government property." He paused, considering. "Though I doubt he'll live long enough to stand trial." As they lifted Samuel from his horse and carried him toward one of the remaining buildings in the fort, he caught a glimpse of movement in the desert beyond. A figure on horseback, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, just long enough for him to recognize Ayana's proud bearing before she disappeared into the vastness that had always been her people's greatest protection. "Go," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Live, remember, make sure the story gets told right." The last thing Samuel saw before unconsciousness claimed him was the first light of dawn breaking over the eastern mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose that made even this harsh country appear beautiful. It seemed like an appropriate image to carry into whatever came next. He had ridden into this adventure as a man running from his past, and he was leaving it as someone who had finally learned the difference between following orders and doing what was right. If death was the price of that knowledge, it seemed like a fair trade. In the growing light of the new day, Fort Defiance stood broken and empty, its walls breached and its purpose defeated. The Apache prisoners were free, the mineral rights documents lost in the explosion, and the systematic campaign to eliminate the last free Apache in the territory had suffered a setback that would take years to overcome. It wasn't justice in the legal sense, but it was justice of a deeper kind, the justice of consequences and second chances, of debts paid and promises kept. And somewhere in the vast desert beyond the broken walls, Apache families were riding towards sunrise and freedom, carrying with them the story of an unlikely alliance that had proven stronger than bullets or bureaucracy. The circle was closed, the promise kept, the debt paid in full, and Samuel Harrison, former cavalry officer turned reluctant hero, slipped into unconsciousness with the knowledge that his life had finally counted for something larger than himself. 6 months later, Fort Apache, Arizona Territory. Samuel Harrison opened his eyes to sunlight streaming through a window he didn't recognize, in a room that smelled of carbolic acid and strong coffee. His first thought was surprise at being alive. His second was wonderment at the absence of pain in his left side, where Calloway's bullet had carved its furrow through muscle and bone. "You're awake," a voice said from beside his bed. "About time." Samuel turned his head carefully and found himself looking at Major William Thompson, the post surgeon whose skill with battlefield medicine was legendary throughout the Territorial Army. Thompson was a lean man with graying hair and the kind of steady hands that came from 20 years of digging bullets out of soldiers who had learned the hard way that Apache warriors were not to be underestimated. "How long?" Samuel's voice came out as a croak, the kind of sound produced by vocal cords that hadn't been used in far too long. 3 weeks since they brought you back from Fort Defiance. You've been in and out of consciousness most of that time, fighting infections and fever dreams that had you talking in Apache half the time." Thompson checked Samuel's pulse with professional efficiency. "Frankly, I'm surprised you survived. That wound should have killed you twice over." Samuel tried to sit up and immediately regretted the attempt. His body felt like it had been taken apart and reassembled by someone working from incomplete instructions. "Morrison? Court-martialed for corruption and illegal appropriation of military resources. Stripped of rank and sentenced to 5 years at military prison. His government contracts were investigated, revealing a network of land speculation and illegal mining operations that reached into the territorial government itself. Seems his superiors weren't pleased with how the Fort Defiance operation turned out." Thompson's expression suggested he found this outcome satisfactory. Losing an entire ammunition depot to a handful of Apache refugees tends to raise uncomfortable questions about competence and judgment. And the prisoners? Thompson's smile was the first genuinely warm expression Samuel had seen since waking up. Gone. Disappeared into the deep desert like smoke on the wind. Morrison's follow-up patrols found exactly nothing, and the territorial government has decided that pursuing scattered refugees isn't worth the expense of a full campaign. Samuel closed his eyes, feeling something that might have been relief or might have been gratitude. Ayanna and her people were safe, at least for now. The promise made to a dying chief had been kept. The debt incurred at Willow Creek finally paid. There's something else, Thompson said, reaching into his jacket and withdrawing a small leather pouch. This was found in your effects when they brought you in. The Apache healer's medicine bundle with a note written in English. Samuel took the pouch with hands that shook slightly from weakness and emotion. Inside was a collection of healing herbs and a piece of paper folded small enough to hide in the bottom of the bundle. The handwriting was careful and precise, the words chosen with the kind of economy that came from people who understood the weight that written language could carry. The debt is paid on both sides. The bond is broken by mutual consent. You are free to choose your own path, as we are free to choose ours. Walk in beauty, soldier. Your father would be proud. It was signed with a simple drawing of an eternal blossom, Ayanna's name rendered in the traditional Apache pictographic style that transformed words into art. Samuel read the note twice, then carefully folded it and tucked it back into the medicine bundle. The formal language couldn't disguise the warmth underneath, the acknowledgement that something important had passed between them during their brief alliance. What happens now? Samuel asked. Thompson leaned back in his chair, studying his patient with the expression of someone delivering news that might not be entirely welcome. Officially, you're being discharged from military custody due to medical incapacity. The charges against you have been quietly dropped, partly because pursuing them would require explaining how a handful of Apache refugees outmaneuvered a full cavalry column. And unofficially? Unofficially, there are people in the territorial government who understand what you did and why you did it. The mineral rights situation has been resolved. The Silver Crown mine claims have been transferred to the Territorial Trust, with the understanding that the land will be preserved for its historical and cultural significance. Samuel absorbed this information slowly, trying to understand all the implications. You're saying the Apache burial ground will be protected? I'm saying that sometimes the right thing happens even when nobody expects it to. Thompson stood and moved toward the window, looking out at the parade ground where soldiers went about their daily routines under the harsh Arizona sun. There's also a ranch outside Tucson looking for a foreman, someone with military experience who understands how to work with diverse populations. The offer was tempting, but Samuel found himself thinking about wider horizons and deeper purposes. 3 months ago, he would have jumped at the chance to disappear into the anonymous safety of civilian life. But his time with Ayanna and her people had changed something fundamental about how he saw his place in the world. I appreciate the offer, Samuel said carefully, but I think my path leads in a different direction. Such as? Samuel thought about the vast desert beyond Fort Apache's walls, about the scattered Apache bands still trying to survive in the hidden places where cavalry patrols couldn't follow, about the knowledge he had gained of their customs and needs, and the trust that had been earned through shared danger and mutual sacrifice. There's going to be a need for people who can serve as intermediaries, Samuel said slowly, working through the ideas he spoke. People who understand both cultures, who can help build bridges instead of burning them. Thompson nodded as if he had expected this answer. It's dangerous work. The government doesn't like intermediaries, and neither side completely trusts people who walk between two worlds. I've gotten used to dangerous work. And you think this is how you want to spend whatever years you have left? Samuel looked out the window at the desert landscape that had nearly killed him and ultimately saved him. Somewhere out there, Apache families were building new lives in the deep wilderness, teaching their children the old ways while adapting to new realities. The work of healing would take generations, but it had to start somewhere with someone. I think it's how I need to spend them, Samuel said finally. I've got debts to pay and promises to keep. Thompson smiled and handed him a set of civilian clothes that someone had thoughtfully provided. In that case, you'd better get dressed. There's a supply wagon leaving for the territorial border in an hour, and the driver might be willing to give a ride to someone heading in that direction. As Samuel slowly dressed, Feeling strength returning to his body with each small movement, he thought about the strange path that had brought him to this moment. 3 years ago, he had been a young soldier following orders that seemed clear and righteous. Now he was something harder to define: a bridge builder, a debt payer, a man who had learned that redemption came not from forgiveness, but from the patient work of making amends. The desert wind carried the sound of distant thunder, promising rain that might or might not come. But even the possibility was enough to make the harsh landscape seem more welcoming, more full of potential for growth and renewal. Samuel Harrison walked out of Fort Apache as a free man for the first time in his adult life, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back in a medicine bundle that represented the most valuable thing he had ever owned: the trust of people who had learned to judge character by actions rather than words. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the long, patient work of helping two wounded peoples learn to heal together. Behind lay the certain safety of military service and civilian anonymity. The choice was easy. Samuel climbed onto the supply wagon and settled in for the long ride toward whatever came next. His face turned toward the horizon where Apache fires burned in the gathering dusk, marking the way to a future that no one could predict, but everyone would help to build. The circle was complete, but the story was just beginning. The supply wagon rolled through a landscape transformed by recent rains. Where once only sparse desert grass had grown, now wildflowers painted the valley floor in brilliant colors. Samuel watched the transformation with something approaching wonder. Even the harshest country could bloom when given the right conditions. 2 hours out from Fort Apache, the driver pulled up at a crossroads. "This is where our paths part, friend," he said. "Good luck with whatever you're riding toward." Samuel shouldered his small pack and walked toward the northern trail, the one that led into the deep desert where no cavalry patrols ventured. In his pocket, Kiona's medicine bundle rustled softly with each step, a reminder of debts paid and new obligations freely chosen. The sun was setting when he saw the smoke. Not the black smoke of destruction, but the clean gray of cooking fires, rising from a hidden canyon perhaps 2 miles ahead. Apache smoke, carefully managed to disperse before it could be seen from a distance. Samuel approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. When he reached the canyon rim, he found a young Apache brave waiting for him, bowstrung but not drawn. "I am looking for Ayana," Samuel said in the Apache he had been learning during his recovery. "I have come to fulfill a promise." The brave studied him for a long moment. "She said you would come. She said to tell you, a good tracker learns to follow more than footprints." Samuel smiled. "Then tell her, I have learned to follow my heart." The brave nodded and disappeared into the rocks. Minutes later, 3 figures emerged from the hidden trail. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. Ayana moved with the same fluid grace he remembered, but now she carried herself like a woman who had found peace with the past. "You took your time," she said when she reached him. "I had to learn how to walk a new path," Samuel replied. "I'm still learning." Kiona stepped forward and placed her hand over his heart, feeling its steady rhythm. "This beats stronger now," she said approvingly. "The healing is complete." Naomi grinned. "So what now, white man? You going to learn how to live like Apache?" Samuel looked at the 3 women who had saved his life and taught him what honor truly meant. "I'm going to learn how to live like a human being," he said. "I figure that's enough of a challenge for one lifetime." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Samuel Harrison walked into the canyon and toward a future he couldn't have imagined 6 months ago. Behind him, the old life lay buried with the sunset. Ahead, the real work of redemption was just beginning. The circle was indeed complete, but the story, as the Apache knew well, was eternal as the desert itself, continuing in endless cycles of loss and renewal, endings that were really beginnings, and the patient work of healing that connected all living things under the vast Arizona sky.